Thank you, Ian. I've already seen a lot of commonalities between Blanchot and André Gide, which I wasn't aware of. One of which is this interest in the experimentation with the form of the novel, which is not one or which is not called a novel. He uses the word récit. Gide uses also the word récit, but also uses the word sortie, that is a kind of medieval farce, and he reserved the term novel only for the text Les Faux Monnayeurs, the counterfeiters from 1925. And there are other commonalities, such as the emphasis on a novel as a work in progress, the unforeseeable, the throwing of the dice, and of course, meta-narrative reflection. But I guess we can probably talk about this later on. I'm sorry I don't have a handout. I have very few quotations, which now I don't need to cut out, and I will read them also in English translation. According to a recent introduction to the modernist novel by Stephen Kern, the present became an especially important locus of experience, and modernist writers were living fully in the present, and their novels variously paused to dilate the present of their characters by means of a continuous present tense, beginning again the inelastic present, moments of being, and so on. In this context, André Gide's multiple experiments with narrative fiction not only set him apart from the primarily retrospective procedures of the modernist novel à la Proust, but show above all a sustained concern with the present as it intersects with multiple temporalities. Gide's continuous evolution toward new narrative genres and the constant reshaping of often autobiographically grounded experiences leads him to experiment with different narrative representations of temporality. For the purposes of this brief talk, I propose a chronological development that comprises basically three different stages. The first stage may be exemplified by the very early work Palude from 1895, a sort of parody of Gide's own affiliations with the literary school of symbolism. This stage is characterized by the sense of stagnation, the abolition of every sense of temporal development. The second stage is embodied by the short novel L'Immoraliste, the Immoralist from 1902, associated with the fullness of the instant, with a sense of vitalism and proto-existentialism, which in narrative terms is expressed by the mode of retrospection. The third and final stage is achieved by Gide's mature signature novel, Les Faux Monnayeurs, 1925, which abandons the retrospective perspective in favor of what Gide himself calls a future-oriented mode, or a mode where time is presented not in a horizontal slice, but rather in a vertical one, where different narrative threads build up an effect of simultaneity. The complex interlacings of this novel propose an understanding of modernism that is distinguished by the co-presence of different forms of temporality, by the essentially open-ended and flow-like structure of the text. So in what follows, I will basically sketch this arguably simplified progression of these three different stages. Number one, stagnation. Gide's anti-novel Palude, an early satirical and metafictional work, already indicates by its very title, Palude means literally marsh, land, that this is a text essentially concerned with stagnation, including temporal stasis, and thus it is representative of the timelessness of Gide's early works, and with its preference for the aleatoric organization of episodes and isolated moments, it also still resonates with the aesthetics of decadence. Written in the form of a diary, there are many precise chronological notations, yet the narrative, if we can want to call it that, refuses any sense of temporal development and describes a closed circle, echoing the idea of a closed, sedentary, and self-absorbed society of symbolist literati, the prime target of this satire. As a late symbolist and highly metaphorical work, Palude is representative for a crisis of the novel and hence also for a crisis of temporality as the realm of human experience and development. It's a text that is explicitly set within the chronological time frame of 6 days, yet this residual time frame is ironic since it is deprived of the sense of causal relations. The subject's expression through the form of a chronological written diary is of course typical for the introspective, subject-centered inflection of the novel around the 1890s, yet in Palude we have an entirely undefined self and a series of repetitions and non sequiturs. Moreover, the subject entertains the diary for a peculiar form of self-accounting that he himself calls imprévu négatif. This is to say that the diary sets out to register the subtraction of what has been done from what should have been done. And here I quote, "In my agenda, I draw out the sentiment of duty. I write 8 days in advance so that I have time to forget and thus to create surprises for myself, indispensable with my way of life. Thus every night I fall asleep before an unknown tomorrow and yet already decided by myself." Although the writer-protagonist is clearly satisfied with this program, it is of course a ridiculously negative version of temporality where nothing is passed off as something, passivity as action. Stage number 2, distance and retrospection. Even the later prose works by Gide, read from today's perspective, appear to develop curiously out of historical time. The two works I now turn to, L'Immoraliste and La Symphonie Pastorale from 1919, continue Palu's diary-like structure, yet combine it with the idea of a retrospective account, but in contrast to the earlier work, they strike a more earnest, existential, even tragical note. Although radically different in style, they both feature a male protagonist who retrospectively seeks to justify a hedonist, guilty love in conflict with the obligations of bourgeois marriage. L'Immoraliste is significant because of the importance it assigns to the term life, la vie, the most frequently used noun throughout the novel. The novel's discourse of vitality and the metaphysics of life is intimately tied to the temporal conception of life itself and a heroic conception of subjectivity. In fact, the novel itself, via the voice of its regenerating protagonist, Michel, shows how the relation to his wife, Marceline, who is suffering from a progressive illness, is overshadowed by an orientation toward the future, and Michel's search for self-identity is thus both encumbered by the past-orientedness of his former archaeological studies, as well as by the future-orientedness of care for the suffering other. In the middle of the novel he says, "Ah, how dangerously does our happiness rest on hope, and on an uncertain future. I, who once could not enjoy anything but the past, the sudden sense of the instant would intoxicate me one day, yet the future disenchants the present hour more even than the present disenchants the past." On his way toward his new life, Michel encounters the enigmatic, homosocial, and Epicurean figure of Menalque, whose advice for Michel is precisely the abolition of remembrance as well as a preoccupation with the future by celebrating the sensuous joy of the instant associated with the Arabic South. Yet if this cynical joy, as Michel comes to call it, may be seen as the underlying doctrine of Michel's newfound vitalism, it cannot be equated with the subjectivity effect expressed by the novel itself, insofar as the text of the novel depends on Michel's oral and retrospective account to a group of friends. The present moment of Annunciation is marked by a situation of utter helplessness precisely because he seems to have lost any connection to his past. Toward the end of the novel, Michel wants to isolate himself from the process of temporal duration by returning to the places of an earlier, supposedly less estranged time, but in fact he cannot really reconnect to his past. "I lie down in the middle of the day to deceive the dreary prospect of time." If this narrative presents a character who seeks to escape time, the subsequent Symphonie Pastorale presents an interesting transitional middle ground between the retrospective self-justification and an intimation of lived time. In La Symphonie Pastorale, it is made even clearer how the identity of the self depends on self-distance and the experience of temporal development. While in the first reading this notion of emphatic individuality is tied to the moment of the present, we might also recognize here a structure of self-distance that actually associates full identity with the future transcendence of the present. In terms of the phenomenological discussion of time, Mark Curry has written, quote, "that the future-oriented project of anticipatory resoluteness creates a split in the self and produces a temporal distance between the reflective consciousness and the consciousness reflected on, a distance which decreases as Dasein tries to catch up with or actualize its own projections." As Curry further points out, first-person narration is especially germane for the temporal aspects of self-distance. Of particular relevance for Gide is also the fact that such forms of narrative are indebted to the structure of the Christian confession, which is to say that the temporal difference also entails a moral revision of the past moments of the self from the perspective of the present of Annunciation. The unreliability of the narrator is dramatized precisely by the exposure of a prior state of ignorance. Again, typical for such a form is that the temporal distance between past and present of the self, between the narrator and the narrated, decreases as the narrative progresses. And this approximation of the subject and the object of narrative leads to a veritable crisis, the collapse of temporal distance as a precondition for narration. Now, La Symphonie Pastorale is modeled precisely on the decrease of temporal distance. The short text, written by a fictional Protestant pastor who falls in love with a blind girl, Gertrude, that he has adopted for supposedly merely philanthropic reasons into his family, is divided into two parts. The first part is conceived as a retrospective memoir, where the pastor frequently invokes the authority of the Bible and addresses God and the reader directly with the clear intent of self-justification. The second part abolishes the sense of temporal distance and is brought ever nearer to the time of the present, the form of a diary, where narrative time and the time of narration become ever closer. In the process, the narrating subject leaves behind the transcendencies of the God and the Bible, approximating a state where the value of immediate life rules supreme, if not exempt from the reader's moral judgment. The narrative and ethical ambiguity of this text results precisely from the unwitting superimposition of different temporalities, the time of the past and the time of writing, as associated respectively with the genre of memoir and diary. The pastor inevitably registers what has passed to happen, yet he also wants us to make believe his good, pious intentions. A further irony of the text is the pastor's self-delusion that he would never keep the blind Gertrude in an illusionary, timeless world of goodness, which is precisely what he will do, but at least he wants to make the reader believe that in the beginning he was blind to his own blindness. The strategy of self-justification is further emphasized when the pastor mentions that in the future his wife Amélie, or the no longer blind Gertrude, or the reader will read his text, while the narrator declares his intention to represent a developmental history with a precise ordering. He acknowledges at times the intermissions of his later knowledge, but only in the second part, in rereading his own text, he changes the focus from Gertrude's history to an investigation of his own soul. If, as Curry has remarked, the writing of a text is fundamentally at odds with the temporality of lived experience, then La Symphonie Pastorale dramatizes precisely this problem. My third and final stage, chance, side-shadowing, and future. The heightened self-consciousness of the difference between lived experience, the immersion in the flux of time, and its narrative representation leads to the full-fledged metafictional experiment of Les Faux Monnailleurs. As Gide comments in the journal of the Faux Monnailleurs, this novel contains not only a dimension of temporal retrospection, but the dimension of human existence is explored here also in a prospective sense of the future. This virtual orientation towards the future present, entails that in Les Faux Monnailleurs, the references to contemporary history take on a rather abstract and metaphorical significance, despite its panoramic and quasi-epic abundance of different narrative threads and themes. It is a novel that is not built on a firm ground of historical referentiality, but one that clearly privileges moral and aesthetic questions that, in Gide's vision, transcend their immediate time. In his earliest projections of this work, Gide had planned to use the event of the First World War as a clear break in historical experience, especially with regard to the repercussions in the structure of the bourgeois family. So much so that the projected epic novel would have been divided into 3 different parts, and the event of the war marking the frontier between before and after. The final work, however, has pushed the war to the margins. While the novel was written between the years 1919 and 1925, the actual narrative time comprises basically 6 months, although the embedded journal of the writer Edouard, commenting on an implied novel within the novel with the same title, reaches yet another 6 months back into the near past. From some few explicit references, we can surmise that the novel is supposed to take place in the years 1908, 1909, yet various other references to cultural and political events ultimately show that different temporal situations are superimposed. For instance, the appearance of Alfred Jarry, a notorious protagonist of the early French avant-garde, does not exactly fit the historical time frame, since he had already died in 1907, and the scandalous premiere of his play Ubu Roi, also alluded to in the novel, already took place in 1896. While many of the political and social references typically refer to the time before the First World War, the third part contains a number of specific cultural allusions that refer to the time after the war. We realize that Gide subordinates temporal measuring to a radically subjective perspectival sense of how time is perceived, including the distortion of correct chronology, the impossible co-presence of historical characters, and so on. All of this immerses the reader into a present, but a present that is composed of multiple inflections and individual perspectives, as well as one that revisits events of a more or less recent past, partly with the help of the journal or letters incorporated into the novel. Moreover, above all in the journal of Edouard, we also find an emphasis on the possibilities of existence, namely the fact that what might be possible is privileged over what has been the case. Such a notion of side-shadowing, as Michael Bernstein has termed it, is not unfamiliar in literary modernism. Yet Gide is not merely interested in temporal relativism. There are a number of scenes where the most literal clock time is recorded in the narration. In an early key scene of the novel, the young Bernard discovers a letter of his mother that reveals the fact of his bastardy while he is repairing a standing clock. In this sort of context, clock time stands for sovereignty of causality that might be adjusted to individual circumstances, but which nevertheless inserts the actions of the subject in a chain of causality with consequences one cannot control. As in, say, Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes, Gide's novel questions the temporal logic of realism. It even explores the ramifications of radically unmotivated actions. I don't have time here to talk about the gratuit. As well as a sense of subjectivity in constant flux that is discontinuous with itself, an idea for which Gide is heavily indebted to the incoherent and self-contradictory characters in Dostoevsky, and whose legacy has explicitly contrasted with the one of Balzac, who, in the words of Gide, was always centrally concerned with the logical consequences of a person. The repeated references to clock time, even when they are unspecified, serve for the vaguely personalized narrator to construct a sense of objective simultaneity, which nevertheless in narrative fiction can only be expressed sequentially, even as the narrator foregrounds the need to focus on one scene at a time. Among the multiple interwoven narrative threads of Les Faux Monnailleurs, it is easy to lose sight of the fact that is, at least in some respect, with regard to Bernard, a sort of Bildungsroman. If at the beginning of the novel Bernard leaves his parental home in a rebellious spirit, at the end of the novel he finally comes to the realization to accept his father. Bernard is more directly defined by the temporality of emotional duration. Gide's earlier fictions are immoral to the extent that they inscribe the self in a falsified past, while in Les Faux Monnailleurs the aspect of temporal duration and the consequences of action become the ground for a morally responsible identity. Like his alter ego, the internal novelist Edouard, Gide also does not subscribe to the notion that a good novelist has to know how his novel will end when starting it. Yet in contrast to Edouard, and in contrast to his initial plan, Gide does not end the novel with the words, "might be continued," but rather, as we have seen, with Bernard's return to his home, while the very last words of the novel suddenly bring up his little brother. During the high point of European modernism, then, Gide encounters the traditional conception of temporal progression with a sort of Bergsonian emphasis on duration and the experience of lived time. present that is of the moment, yet also linked to growth, revision, and virtual extension, as well as the presence of the self-conscious narrator who knows that his and his characters' willful actions can only occur in a complicated web of consequences and chance.